everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this Economist Events webinar, Achieving the Promise of Analytics and Machine Learning in Healthcare. This is sponsored by InterSystems. The healthcare industry is increasingly under pressure to ensure a steady flow of high-quality, actionable data. The consequences of overlooking this imperative are harmful. A bad data foundation results in meaningless and misleading outputs. Hand in hand, there's been a surge in data visualization to make data scientists out of citizens and get the general public to see the bigger data picture. This data-driven healthcare culture, fueled by the pandemic, will without doubt outlive it. The emphasis on unearthing facts and figures and making them universally digestible will be hugely consequential. Enacting this mandate, though, hinges on putting the right infrastructure in place, and this extends far beyond just investing in technology. I am joined today by a panel of experts to discuss the ins and outs of this. Our speakers are Don Woodlock, Vice President of Healthcare Solutions for InterSystems, Benjamin Sigalzi, Vice President, Global Health Insights Data and Experimental Analysis for Roche, Jason Forrest, who is Director of Interactive's COVID Response Center at McKinsey, and Eric Anderson, a Head Data Scientist in AI for Novartis. So I wanted to start us off with a fairly broad question about what data-driven healthcare looks like. So Don, can I turn to you first?
Sure.
How do you see the kind of data that your team generates and the analysis being used in healthcare?
Well, I think of data-driven healthcare basically, and data generally as kind of a utility. You know, we provide electricity, water, to our folks, our doctors, our researchers, our data scientists. We should also be providing data. And wouldn't it be great if everybody, as they're going about their job and healthcare, really had the data that they needed to do a good quality job with it? And so far, we haven't necessarily provided that. And so having this data foundation, as you talked about in the intro, kind of bringing data together, normalizing it, unifying it, putting it into the workflow of the people that actually need it, so the right person at the right time at the point of decision, I think is what we really need in healthcare, and that would really put it to good use and really allow people in healthcare to make the best decisions for patients and for our populations.
Right. Well, that's interesting. And perhaps Eric, to introduce Novartis into this conversation, how do you see the importance of big data and data in healthcare?
So data is really important in the pharmaceutical life cycle. When we start talking about drug development, we have to go through and make sure that all of the data is not only properly ingested, but properly curated and accessible. And so this is a remarkably difficult problem, particularly when we start talking about aspects related to clinical trials. So when we have worldwide clinical trials, we have to abide by all of the different governmental laws and regulations for data tenancy, where the data is living physically around the world. And so we've developed a whole team surrounding this called Data 42 that is really responsible for making sure all of the data is in place, it's well curated, well ingested, and is ready for actual use by data scientists. It's really a tremendous undertaking.
Yes, I can see a great value really with the volume of data, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, for trials that people need these days. Do you have any thoughts there from Roche, particularly on the use of data in trials?
Absolutely, yes, Rob. Like Eric said, yes. Just like Eric said, the one challenge definitely is the complexity of the geographical distribution of our studies. and the sheer volume of the clinical data that we have. But on top of that, there's a second aspect. And this is where Roche is actually investing a lot of effort into it. And that's precision medicine. This is personalized healthcare. Because we are living in a world now where we have a multitude of ways how to assess a patient's condition. We can look into a patient's genome and the mutation of a specific cancer type. We have digital pathology. We have microbiome data. We have about a dozen of different data modalities around a patient. And I think, Rob, we are going to talk about interoperability later. But it is this complexity of different data types that you have to harmonize and bring contextually around the patient, and then aggregate to the volumes where we reach big data volumes for machine learning, artificial intelligence. So it's those two dimensions that both play an important role.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, I'd like to turn to interoperability. And maybe, Jason, this is an opportunity to bring you into the discussion. I know your team have been working a lot on creating scalable data engineering practices. Is there anything you'd like to say about, add to that conversation?
Well, what's interesting about this is that Benjamin just talked about the complexity of data. Eric talked about the importance of making that data accessible, and Don talked about the fact that this data is a bit of a utility. But what my role is to make it communicative, right? I mean, the complexity of the data that we have and the complexity of COVID data in particular saw a mandate for data visualization to kind of cut through the complexity and to be able to communicate the importance of various findings, whether that would be vaccination trials, whether that be just even the spread of the pandemic, and also even just alerting different populations around the world about what was coming to them. And that's where DataViz came in. So my team works across a variety of healthcare and economic data as relates to the pandemic. And what we found is that collaborating with subject matter experts really helps us to get to that targeted, understandable, even intuitive ability to read this data and then make decisions or live your life in response to the information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And are there barriers to the interoperability of that data? It sounds like there are a lot of different users across those four perspectives. What are some of the key hurdles? Perhaps Ben, you could take that one on. What are the key hurdles to some of the interoperability that we've heard of?
I try to make it short because this is a huge topic. But in the industry, we are working with a principle called FAIR. And FAIR stands for F like findable, A accessible, I for interoperable, and R for reusable. And the biggest hurdle is exactly in that order. We even are struggling to find data, historical data, even just 5-year-old data. When you think about all those different modalities, and then storing them with the right description, the right metadata, so that in 5 years' time you can still find it. It sounds trivial, but it's actually quite the extraordinary logistical problem. And then if you know where the data is, to get access to that data, because all of these different data modalities are stored in different data systems. And they are primarily are built for the primary use of data. So you have data specialists who use the data once as it has been collected, they run their analysis, and then they move on. Usually these systems are not built to reuse the data, to integrate the data and aggregate it. So these are, and there are well-known metrics out there in the industry that data scientists spend 70 to 80% of their time with trying to find the data, getting access to the data, and then wrangling the data into some shape and form before they can even start to analyze the data. So these are huge hurdles that we are addressing.
Yeah. I see many in the audience, many of our experts nodding there. Maybe, and Dan raised your hand there. Were you wanting to come in about this this aspect
Yeah,
of
sure.
interoperability barriers?
Sure. I like that FAIR model that Ben talked about. That's an interesting way to look at it. And I deal a lot with healthcare providers, so they don't have the F problem of finding the data. They have it, but that doesn't make it that much easier. So you have to pull the data out of the various systems, as Ben said. You have to standardize and normalize it, and then you have to get it back into workflow so it makes a difference. And on the normalization, I have two stories on this. On the normalization front, we're working with a customer just on counting number of urgent care visits they've had and counting inpatient days. And there's a 5-page Word document floating around between us, just defining those two concepts. What exactly is an urgent care visit, and when do we count a patient day? Is it at noon? Is it if the patient was there at any point during the day? And it's very complicated, even easy metrics, never mind more difficult things like clinical coding, categorizing high-risk diabetics, those sorts of things. And then the challenge, visualization, communicative. I think that's an interesting topic. I'm interested in hearing more from the panel on that. But just getting it back into the workflow, the nurses, the doctors, workers, taking care of the patients. I had another customer tell me about a machine learning model that they built around predicting patient readmissions. They paid $1.25 million to some vendor to build this model, and the whole thing got thrown away because the nurses rejected it. It didn't really fit into their workflow. They didn't really understand its results, and there was a lot of high science there, a lot of sophistication. But if it doesn't really match the way that user is making a decision or that person's making a decision in the system that they're in, it just doesn't really go anywhere. So there's a lot of challenge around making data actually actionable in the workflow at the right place, which is kind of the last hurdle in this process.
Yeah. One other aspect, I suppose, to make it usable is the sort of standards that internationally people have, and I know most of you work internationally. Is there a move to standardize some of the language and, as you say, the data fields and whatever for these clinical uses that you're talking about? Who would be?
I'll give it a go. We do have an international standard for clinical data, which is CDISC. It's called CDISC, and it's well established. And it's also the standard data model to transfer data to regulators, to health authorities. But standards are not a stale entity. They are not stable in that such, because science moves on. We develop further and further methodologies to assess a patient's condition, and therefore we continually have to reassess standards, build new standards. So it's a very, very dynamic field. And if you build longitudinal data marts, you follow a patient cohort over certain years, you will actually have to update your standards on a regular basis again and again. So this is really in itself within data scientists. Data standards is an art on its own.
Yeah. And I can imagine it being more difficult for different purposes, and particularly perhaps for AI. I'd like to just bring in Eric here on machine learning and AI. Is there barriers that you can see in terms of the interoperability of data that's used in the algorithmic world?
Absolutely. So not only when we're dealing with model development and training, we have to develop all of these different readers and ingestion pipelines to not only just read these standard data, but also process them, pre-process them, normalize them, and get them ready for learning by the model. But then when we actually start doing this retrospectively with data that was collected years ago, perhaps, not all of the data sets are created the same. So we might have holes in some of these data that are, they were designed for a clinical trial. That clinical trial got conducted, and we want to combine them with perhaps a newer clinical trial that has slightly different data acquisition characteristics. And this represents a really big problem in the AI world because when we start talking about training these models, we really want everything to be the same. So all of the inputs that we would expect, we really want them to be well aligned. And that's really very rarely the case when we start talking about mixing these different trials.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Another question that we've had from the audience is linked to really data literacy. So the linked data systems to provide citizens with access to their own health records and data. And I know that you've all been very passionate about this and the use, perhaps, that data could be used for patient education and data literacy. As a key, Ben, again, maybe, I know you've described data literacy as a key driver for good decision making. Could you describe the role of visualization and data literacy in some of that?
No, absolutely, and this is where I do very much hope that our new technologies, also with prospective curation, prospective verification of data, liberates data scientists and data consumers to spend more time in understanding the data that we're looking at, rather than just cleaning the data and wrangling the data, spending more time to really look at the data and see what's the context that the data has been collected in. And that's where visualization, of course, can be of tremendous help, because visualization helps you to distinguish signal from noise. It helps you to see the big patterns that are emerging so that you're not chasing some irrelevant patterns in the data. It helps you to clean the data. It helps you to understand and analyze the data. Because a result out of a data set is only as valuable as your understanding of the data itself. And this is of tremendous importance. We have seen this also right now with COVID, interpreting data, understanding data. I hear quite often how efficacy rates of one vaccine is being compared with the efficacy rate of another vaccine, which doesn't make sense at all, because these efficacy rates only tell you the truth of the patient cohort of that one clinical trial. And that one clinical trial had a patient cohort in a specific time frame of the pandemic and within a geographic region. And the other clinical trial has, again, a different cohort. And if you don't have that data literacy up front, then you very likely are risking to compare apples with pears.
Yeah, let me jump in here.
Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
So, I think the thing that's so fascinating about that comment, Benjamin, is that, with actually, speaking to Eric's point about refining a pipeline that needs to be very standardized for machine learning and AI, with COVID data, we were scrambling globally just to figure out how we could even count information, how we could even collect it, let alone even share it. Right. So it went from a highly recognized data engineering structure to like, oh my gosh, what does this number even mean? How am I even collecting it? And something like anywhere between 9 and 14 steps just to collect and standardize and centralize that data. So like super, super challenging infrastructural tasks there. But like Benjamin also said, this data is so nuanced. It's so difficult to figure out that the term flatten the curve took a very abstract concept and was able to basically describe it into a picture for people to readily understand. That's where the magic is in collaborating between subject matter experts like my fellow panelists and people that do communications data visualization. It's a team sport. And it's only really when you collaborate with your healthcare professionals, your economists, your frontline emergency workers, that you actually are really able to strip away all that noise that Benjamin just talked about and get to that message. It's so important.
Yes. I can imagine design is very important, and maybe was Dodd, you were wanting to come in.
I was going to comment on a different part of your question, which is about patients getting hold of their own data, because that certainly is one of the the trends and kind of a regulatory push in many countries is to have patients have some kind of electronic ability to sort of pull their record on, into apps of their choosing, basically. And I think that's going to be an interesting on this topic of visualization, data understandability, that sort of thing. As people start to get a hold of their records, try to make sense of it, people build apps and websites and other tools to help a patient kind of manage their condition and really understand the data about themselves. So I think that'll be kind of a fascinating trend. I mean, COVID was fascinating in and of itself, trying to explain sort of the metrics to the general public and watching what worked and didn't work. And I certainly think patients getting a hold of their own data will sort of further data literacy, which I think is quite good for us.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think beyond data literacy, there's actually a lot of improved understanding of the sort of epidemiological data, I suppose, that's come through COVID. I mean, I listened to some of the BBC reports on this here in London, and I think the sort of depth of analysis that people, when they put their effort towards explaining data and what it means, and some of the biases that you talk about, Ben, in terms of different cohorts of studies, I think there is an opportunity here for patients or citizens to be educated. Perhaps, Eric, again on machine learning and AI, can you see a role there for improving data literacy? Is there a sort of AI solution, if you like, for some of this thing?
Yeah, so there's been a number of projects that have gone on in the visualization community, things like Many Eyes, where it is really designed to crowdsource visualization techniques for types of data. And, one thing that I want to be very certain that gets said is we as a community need to take care when we start publishing these visualization techniques to a wider audience. It is very easy to use visualization to tell a story that you think the data should be telling rather than the story that the data itself can tell. And so, by putting these tools out into the community without any education or way of having the general public be aware of exactly what's going on with this tremendously nuanced data represents, in my mind, a substantial risk to the widespread adoption of not just data understanding. So to talk a little bit about the AI significance of this, there's work going on to have AI and intelligent systems do some of this tailoring of visualization techniques to specific data in order to help prevent some of these potential misdirections that might happen in the display of this data.
Yeah, no, a good point. We had an audience question actually about some of the breakthroughs needed to make AI learning even more usable in the community, and I wonder whether Ben might wanted to take on that again. So how would we make the data even more usable than it is at the moment, in a step change, perhaps, in the way that we look at these things?
This is a big question, and I do think it all starts at the source. Let me give you one example. I live here in Switzerland. I go to my dentist, and I do see that most of my patient records at my dentist are still handwritten on some little cards, and is being filed in a drawer. And that's where it starts. I have my house physician, I have my dentist that I go to, and my data, my personal patient data, is scattered all over the place. Half of it is electronic, the other half is handwritten somewhere, and that's where all of these are dead ends for data, right? And we can have the greatest artificial intelligence machines out there. If we don't prepare our data in a machine-readable format upfront, if we don't have the right balance between data sharing principles and data privacy principles at hand, so that the data users can confidently use them, then the data will not be actionable. And so at the moment, I see the big bottleneck is not with the models, is not with the algorithms, the self-learning algorithms. It is really the data itself that is still stuck in systems, in handwritten formats, in non-standardized old legacy data sets that we need. And it's liquid gold. It's liquid gold that is stored somewhere, and we need to make it actionable. This is what I am passionate about.
Mm. I see Don had your hand up. Maybe you have some good examples, Don, of where data's been used to make a real impact in these areas.
Well, sure. I certainly agree with Ben. Data is the biggest problem in machine learning. The algorithms, I think, are up for the job, or up for a lot of jobs in healthcare, but the data is really not. But even when it's digitized, you usually have an incomplete picture. So some of the machine learning models over the past year around COVID have been, let's say, predicting, the chance you'd be in the ICU, had COVID. And one of the key features of that model that rises up to the top is comorbidities. What other problems do you have?
Yes.
Well, usually the record of your other problems are in other systems, your oncology system, or your, other kind of specialists that you see out in the community, and the information you have in the system that's trying to do the prediction is just a subset of the patient information. So you have an inaccurate model because you have a subsetted picture of the patient record. And a lot of data is like that. It can be handwritten, like Ben said, and it's not that useful much at all. But even if it's digitized, you usually have an incomplete picture of the situation. Another example that I have is we did a machine learning model with a customer around predicting no-shows, so patients that wouldn't show up to their appointments. And we used data that the patient put in their questionnaire, in their patient portal, around number of people in the household, access to travel, more the social determinants of health style data, not the strictly clinical data. And of the top 15 features of that model, 8 of them were from those social determinant factors. So not only is social determinant something that's very important to your health, but it's also important to, whether you show up for an appointment or not, or whether you pick up your medication, or those kinds of things. So really having kind of that broad base of information in data is very difficult. And I think that's the challenge with machine learning today. The algorithms are, quite far ahead of the data at this point in healthcare.
Yes. Eric, I saw you quickly put your hand up there. Did you have a comment on the what seems to me like a bit of a dilemma between whether we improve the AI or whether we improve the data, or which comes first, really? So,
Well, really, they both need to be improved, and fortunately, they can be improved in parallel. So everybody has spoken a bit about the perils of the data not being up to shape, but I think there's another aspect where we start leveraging these AI models in a clinical environment, and there's not a well-defined level of trust between the clinician or physician looking at and using these models and what the models are providing. And so this idea of explainability of how these models are arriving at whatever decisions they're making is really very important to the field as a whole. And this is an active topic of research. There are a lot of people working on this problem, and it's as yet painfully slow in terms of how quickly we can get some of these solutions to be explainable, not just to the people who are developing models, but explainable in terms of, will the explanation be acceptable from a clinical and a clinical practice standard?
I could see a lot of.
I totally agree with that. I don't have a long comment on that, but I totally agree with what Eric said. Explainability is really a requirement in healthcare. I can't see, ML models being put to good use by people that don't understand why they say what they say. So I do think explainability is sort of a key requirement, and it's It's not, it's not as easy as it sounds, because one of the things that we've been working on is causation, not just correlation. So if you're telling a discharge nurse that the probability of this patient being discharged today is low, let's say, and you might tell her the top features of the model, but it doesn't mean if you change those features, the patient's going to be discharged. ML models are really focused on correlation, and what people really would like is sort of what's causing this probability, what's causing this outcome, what might I be able to do about it, how is this model helping me make different decisions. And that's really going the extra mile in terms of explainability and visualization, and that's that really does need evolution in our industry.
And it strikes me it's got to be shown to be better than what's happening at the moment, really, rather than and models
Sure.
are as good as your input, but there's a sort of validation, if you like, system that people need to have trust in as well. So a sort of independent assessment of the accuracy of a model. Yeah. One question we had from the audience, and it's sort of off the topic, so do bring me back to this idea of validation, if you like, but is around developing countries. And I suppose, COVID showed us how vulnerable perhaps some parts of the world are for diseases in general, not just COVID, but any chronic disease as well. Have you any thoughts about how these issues might play out in sort of developing parts of the world, and are there some easy wins there?
I might just take a stab at this because I'm quite passionate of this. Of course, the one important part will always be clinical data collected at centers. But having said that, a lot of developing countries are very, very advanced when it comes to their mobile technologies. There's a surprising density and usage of mobile phones there. And maybe it's not that well known yet to the public, but our mobile phones more and more turn into medical assessment centers. And there's a tremendous amount of medical data that you can derive from using your mobile phone. It goes even to the point with neurodegenerative diseases where the gyroscope of your mobile can assess how calmly you hold it for Parkinson's disease, for example, right? There are derivation algorithms for voice recognition that again tells you the level of Parkinson's progression. We just ran trials at Roche with this. It is unbelievable what a potential untapped potential yet we do have with so-called digital biomarkers, which are being derived from mobile devices. So that's just one aspect that we can invest more in.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And I suppose the more we hear about the smart aspects of smartphones, and I suppose this will rely on penetrance of the technology actually into some of these words. Any other examples people have from around the world of interesting? I like the Parkinson's one. I've heard of sort of atrial fibrillation being diagnosed by phone as well, and all sorts of other sensors, I suppose, is the other aspect to this. Any use of the sort of other things apart from Fitbit exist, but any sort of data that's used through smartphones that you'd like to share?
Well, so it's not directly related to that exact question, but I do think that the more data we can ingest from developing countries, each piece of data will improve our modeling capabilities by a considerable amount. As of right now, I shouldn't say all, a large number of the clinical trials and the data that's been ingested for them are highly biased. And what I mean by that is, these clinical trials generally will take part in the United States, Canada, Europe, and China. And so because of that, we have an extreme amount of population bias in our training data. And so this could have very nuanced and very unobserved effects in how the final models behave, particularly if we start using this on populations that were not well represented in this training data. And so this represents a large unknown that frankly is unacceptable, and we need to do better about that.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, there's a couple problems with bias like that in machine learning. One is that which is, minority populations have a minority data points sort of by definition. So models are trained on the majority in a sense, and they're going to be less accurate, less useful, all that stuff for kind of underrepresented populations. And the other is machine learning is really, it's kind of trained to predict the past in a sense. You feed it training data from the past, so that's what it knows the best. And if you have a disadvantaged population, their disadvantages are sort of wedded in the past. And so if you turn that model toward the future, which is generally what you do, if you don't do anything interesting with the model, let's say, to kind of analyze it or unbias it, that sort of thing, it's going to replicate those disadvantages moving forward. And there's been some high profile examples of that. So you do have to be careful, from a machine learning point of view and bias, to make sure that your models aren't biased, that it's not going to continue to disadvantage certain populations, that they're accurate with all important subsets of your customers, because most likely they're certainly biased unless you do something about it.
Any other comments on the bias? I'm thinking about how you might mitigate some of those risks. I mean, presumably the bigger one solution is just more data, isn't it, to sort of get less systemic bias into these systems?
Yeah, I disagree with more data. I mean, everybody wants more data, but the reality is that it's really in who's doing the calculations and really who's doing that interpretation. And I think what we've seen across many tech sectors, not just healthcare, is a complete siloed way of thinking where your data scientists are off on an island doing their thing, giving you a result that's statistically important. And then our healthcare practitioners, our frontline workers are trying to interpret that. And, doesn't make any sense. And I think maybe just to kind of complete the circle here is that collaboration between different types of expertise can be, you leverage different levels of data literacy to build that trust, right? And it's a process, and that process really starts with communication across all the different people involved in it, from data collection all the way down to not only the healthcare professional, but indeed, actual people that are listening to the results. And that trust is really hard, and you have to earn it, and you have to invest in it. And to be honest with you, I think we've invested more in data engineering, big data, to a degree, data science, and a lot less in that collaboration and building of authoritative trust.
Ben, you wanted to come in there.
Absolutely, Jason. I think you mentioned something that is of key importance. Just for context, we started about 4.5 years ago a program at Roche called EDIS, Enhanced Data and Insights Sharing, where we retrospectively curated data into deep data marts, but also looked at our business to prospectively make sure the data comes in a fair way, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And back in those days when I've been appointed to be the leader of that program, I naively thought that because I'm doing data science since more than 20 years, I was qualified to do that. And that was one of the biggest thinking errors, because the biggest hurdle that we encountered was cultural, it was mindset, and it was trust. It was. If you think about it, you come from universities, you have research scientists coming from universities. Data is your asset that you hold close to yourself, because that's what you can publish on. This is This is the knowledge that you own. And the last thing you're trained to do is to share it with somebody else. If I share my data with somebody else, first of all, what will that person do with my data? It's my data. Well, number one problem, right? My data. But that other person doesn't understand my data. Only I understand my data. Second of all, if that other person starts to use that data that I am specialized to do, what does that do with my job security? What does that do with my identity as an expert? And so we had several hurdles to overcome until departments, functions, individuals, even divisions started to feel comfortable in opening up and sharing their data assets into those larger data pools. And now we come to the next level, which Jason and Don actually very nicely described. And this is, we need countries to work together. We need countries to start to agree on data sharing principles, on data standards, on exchange formats, so that we can actually start to enrich our data pools to avoid the biases that we have in there. But that requires, again, it requires trust, right? It requires that we start to understand that at the end of the day, the patient data belongs to the patient. It might belong to the hospital. It never belongs to a company. And my colleagues from the legal side would even say that ownership data in itself, from a legal point of view, is an extremely complex matter. So these are very, very interesting conversations that we're getting into there. But I do believe at the heart of it, it's trust. That we have to start to trust to share data.
Yeah. It's a big question, but I suppose how would you begin to develop the trust? It's been a question that's come through the audience too. This question about building trust. Where do you start? Because in a way, you need to be able to share data in a small way to be able to know whether you trust it and its integrity. Are there examples, where people from different agencies, institutions have been able to share data in a sort of useful way where the ownership stayed with patients, as you say? Does that happen?
Absolutely. Maybe I give you one example. If you look at the current legislation of GDPR, which is the widely used data privacy legislation, it is purposefully defined in a relative way. So in a sense that it says anonymized data is then anonymized when with reasonable effort, retro-engineering of the patient identity is not possible. Now, the reason why this is described like that is that our technology over time improves. And so our ability to retro-engineer anonymized data through triangulation, through smart algorithms is improving as well. So whether a data point, a data asset is anonymized or not, is a relative statement dependent on time. And this requires that data producers, data science organizations work very closely together with legislation, with authorities to co-develop these principles forward. We work with world-class hackers, right? Whom we are asking to hack our data to see whether our current knowledge of anonymization holds the fort. And this is how you gain trust, by transparency and by showing that science is not interested in an IP address of a computer. Science is not interested in a patient's name. We are interested in aggregated data. We want to look at patterns in the population. But this requires a transparent conversation, an informed conversation with patients, with the public, and with legislation.
No, that's very, very nice.
I really
Go
like
on, please. Now.
I really like Jason's comments on trust is earned. You know, you really have to invest in it. And perhaps sometimes as a data scientist, you might just expect users to accept what you put out there and published and not really empathize with them and sort of invest in the trust building process. And a small example that we had recently with COVID, we had a number of hospital customers submitting their data to the state in the U.S. Here, and basically every day they would submit the number of patients in the ICU or in the hospital and such. And then the public health agency would call all the hospitals all day long and ask them for their census and their counts. And after a while, when the counts matched the data, they stopped calling. They just trusted the data. And that was just kind of a small example of it being earned. You see the data, you ask enough questions, you get it's reliable, it's predictable, you get into a groove, and then the trust is built, and then things can go more smoothly. And I just think it's a tailored process. You know, there's different ways to do it depending on your users, but you have to really believe that that's an investment that you need to make.
So if I'm going to jump in real quick, I think the number one most important issue in my world, at least, is of COVID-19 vaccination. And I believe that is a singular issue based on trust, right? We have pockets of hesitancy for a variety of different reasons globally. And it's really in the uptake and the ability for a public to trust in the vaccination without fear of some kind of lingering consequences, which is just like so deeply important to everything that we do right now. So don't want to like go off on some hyperbole about it, but it's just fascinating that we have a singular issue that's so deeply connected to how we authoritatively present and hopefully gain this trust from a global audience, global population.
Thanks, Jason. Well, we're moving towards the last quarter of an hour of our panel here. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the sort of future that you see for data analytics and machine learning. So perhaps just some thoughts for, and we'll go around in turn again as we did at the start. So perhaps Eric, would you like to start really the future of machine learning and data visualization, and what would the world look like in five years' time if things have worked out well?
So if things have worked out really well, the future looks a lot like today, only faster. You have a bunch of AI models that are working behind the scenes, and they're working so well that you don't actually realize you're using them at all. And so I think that this is one of the great promises that AI has, is it's not a replacement of any workforce or anything like that, but it's really augmenting the way scientists can work. So it is getting to the same endpoint that a human would get to, but it's doing it at a lot more of an efficient way. So, maybe what took 3 years in order to develop a drug might take only a fraction of that time. And then as it gets coupled with visualization systems and insight development systems, these things become not just more widespread, but wider reaching. So these AI and intelligent systems get deployed into a way that the general population can actually start interacting with their own data in very meaningful ways. And, an informed populace means that there's a lot more opportunity for preventative care and for things to not necessarily get to the point where, they have to go to the doctor for a severe condition, because by examining their own data with some help from an intelligent system, they're able to catch a severe problem before it becomes severe at all. And I think that is one of the best possible outcomes of widespread adoption of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and we've seen some of the speed improve through the pandemic too, haven't we? So of development, particularly, I'm thinking of vaccines, but also, the use of prevention and diagnostic testing, I suppose, and on a whole lot of other things. Yeah, moving to Ben again. Any thoughts that you have on the future and what you'd like to see happening in the next 5 years?
And I'd like to build on what Eric just said, because if we think about how data has been used in the past, then it has been basically generated to prove a hypothesis. So the scientist came up with an idea, with a hypothesis, in vitro, in vivo, and then you conduct an experiment, a scientific experiment, where you collect the data to actually confirm or to reject that hypothesis. And that's it. That's all about the data. But what we see now is actually that by orchestrating the data in the right way, integrating it, harmonizing it, aggregating it, data through smart algorithms can actually support science in generating the hypothesis. And that's a paradigm shift in science, an absolute paradigm shift in science. This can help us save time. This can make the probability of technical success of the PTS of a hypothesis much higher, because you have supporting evidence up front. It can shorten our development times of smart treatments and prevention measures. So by going a little bit into the thought of data being a reusable asset, just unuse it once and throw it away, the gates will open up tremendously into better healthcare, quality of life, and prevention of disease, like Eric said.
Thanks very much. Jason, any thoughts on the future? I like the idea that we're generating more hypotheses. We'll be able to solve more problems the more research questions we have to be able to solve. Jason, any thoughts on the future?
Yeah, so well, I see the future being really focused around humans. We really want to make sure that our work is human. That means it's going to be likely more illustrative and visual. I think that also means it's going to be more multifaceted, where we're going to be able to see certain types of information on demand, and we're going to be able to dig into increasing levels of granularity of that information. And I think the last thing that I think has been really fascinating of watching the increase and rise in telehealth, at least in the United States, is how it's very likely that a first level of kind of on-demand concierge would be even there too. You may not fully understand all the definitions. You may not understand the kind of algorithmically generated suggestions by our healthcare, but you can quickly hop on a chat or a call and speak with someone to get to that interpretation, so that you can get over that barrier of the confusion or even potentially misinformation to that trustable interpretation. So,
yes, and I suppose there's more communication. I mean, both globally and also nationally, the sort of links between people are made so much easier through increased digitalization. Even these webinars sort of illustrate that nicely. Don, any sort of final thoughts on the sort of future?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a couple things. One is I wanted to agree back to Eric with a different point Eric made about machine learning. I think works best when it's kind of inside, an application or environment, and makes it more efficient and intuitive and that sort of thing. I think of like the apps on my phone. I'm sure they all use AI, but none of them come up and say, hey, I'm using machine learning. They just give me a better direction or better translation or better something. And I think having healthcare be more intuitive, having the applications we use be more intuitive, workflows be more intuitive and efficient. I think that's the way artificial intelligence can have a big impact. In terms of data and analytics, though, if I think of the provider market again, we've spent a lot of time and money digitizing. So medical records are now in the computer instead of on paper, but it's about the same as paper. You pull up the record, like you pull up the chart. You sort of look through it and then you put it down when the patient leaves the building, and you don't have those extra uses of data yet. And so I think analytics, data harmonization, visualization, machine learning, population understanding, those are really the next uses of data that we really haven't gotten to yet, because we're still kind of in that first phase of getting everything digitized. So in 5 years, I would like to see people in the healthcare system be making better decisions, having more information at their disposal, having it be trustworthy and understandable, having patients have the information that they need to understand their conditions, and just having data be more empowering than just sort of a little bit of a paper replacement, which it largely is today.
Well, thanks a lot, Don, for those words. I mean, I'd just like to summarize and close today's session really by thanking you all very much for your experts' comments. I found it a fascinating discussion. We've learned a lot about the sort of building blocks, if you like, for this future health system that's built around digital and big data and AI, and the foundations of trust and the sort of human use of data, I think, is obviously a very important part of that, along with the sort of the technical side and the sort of not so much the technical, but the design of data visualization to help people without the expertise understand and trust the sort of uses, if you like, that this data has been put to. So again, thank you all very much. Thank you to InterSystems for sponsoring this event, and you've given us a lot to think about. It'd be fascinating to see how these ideas develop in the future. So I'd just like to thank you all for your attendance.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.